Hey there, curious souls of history. Before we begin, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and ring that little bell. Because tonight, we're going deep into the strangest corners of the Middle Ages, where madness often made perfect sense. Now, imagine this. You wake up in a wooden shack that smells of smoke, sweat, and hay. Outside, church bells ring. You stretch, yawn, and think, maybe I'll take a bath today. But then you remember, it's illegal. Yes, in many medieval towns, bathing too often was considered suspicious. In some places, it was downright sinful, because clean skin could mean only one thing: temptation. That's not a joke. That's history. Welcome to the Middle Ages, a world that was neither dark nor dumb, just desperately logical in its own twisted way. You see, when you live in a time with no antibiotics, no deodorant, and more rats than humans, strange rules start to make sense. Hygiene wasn't about looking fresh. It was about survival. Or, more precisely, not dying of the plague. And so, out of necessity, the weirdest rules in human history were born. Let's start with the law of stench. In 14th century Paris, city officials created regulations controlling where and when you could empty your chamber pot. Not because they cared about cleanliness, but because angry neighbors had started throwing buckets of waste out their windows, sometimes landing on noble heads below. The rule was simple. You could dump your waste only after shouting a warning. "Guard low! Watch out for the water!" If you forgot to shout, or did it at the wrong hour, you could be fined, whipped, or, if unlucky, forced to clean the entire street yourself. It sounds absurd. But remember, there were no sewage systems, no plumbing, no soap factories. The smell of human waste wasn't just disgusting, it was deadly. People believed foul air itself carried disease, the miasma. So regulating stink wasn't about comfort. It was early public health. Now, about those bathing bans. You've probably heard the myth that medieval people never bathed. That's not quite true. They did, but cautiously. In the early Middle Ages, public bathhouses were everywhere. Social hubs where men and women bathed together, talked business, even ate meals in the steam. It was innocent enough at first. Then the church stepped in. By the 13th century, priests were preaching that hot water stirred lust. Bathhouses became associated with sin, and ironically, with disease. When plague swept through Europe, people believed water opened the pores and let sickness in. The dirtier your skin, the safer your soul. So yes, people proudly wore layers of grime like spiritual armor. The strangest part? It might have worked. By avoiding bathhouses, which were crowded, unsterilized, and full of fleas, many people accidentally avoided infection. Dirt became divine protection. It was disgusting and brilliant. Now let's move to something even weirder: the law of shoes. In 1363, King Edward III of England issued a royal decree. No one below the rank of knight may wear shoes with toes longer than 2 inches. You heard that right. Medieval footwear length was regulated by law. Why? Because long shoes meant vanity, and vanity meant rebellion. Fashion wasn't just fashion back then. It was a declaration of power. If a farmer strutted around in pointy silk shoes like a nobleman, the entire social order looked shaky. You couldn't have peasants looking rich. It messed with the illusion that God had put everyone in their rightful place. So the church backed the law. They said long-toed shoes were the devil's work, literally. Priests preached that demons lived in those curled tips, laughing as men tripped over their own pride. But again, there was logic behind the madness. By limiting luxury, rulers kept society stable. In a world of famine and war, envy was dangerous. Sumptuary laws, rules controlling what people could wear, eat, or own, were social safety valves. You couldn't stop inequality, but you could at least stop peasants from looking equal. And that brings us to another strange rule, the law of the tables. In noble households, where hierarchy ruled everything, even the dining table was political. Guests weren't seated for comfort or conversation. They were placed according to status, literally measured in feet from the salt. The closer you sit to the salt, people said, the closer you are to God. Salt was precious, a symbol of purity, wealth, preservation. To sit far from it meant you were less important, possibly even cursed. So every dinner was a social battlefield. Smile wrong, spill your ale, and you might find yourself below the salt the next day. But here's the secret most people forget. All these bizarre customs weren't created by fools. They were coping mechanisms. In a world with disease, chaos, and ignorance, structure was safety. Rules, even stupid ones, gave people control. Take marriage laws, for example. The church banned weddings during Lent, Advent, and certain moon phases. Why? Because they believed cosmic cycles affected fertility, but also because priests didn't want to officiate drunk peasant parties during holy seasons. Practical, restrictive, human. And so, for every strange medieval law, there's a tiny spark of logic, a story hidden beneath centuries of laughter. It's easy for us to look back and say, they were crazy. But imagine living in a world where bad air could kill you, the sky decided your crops, and your doctor's best cure was leeches. In that world, strange rules weren't stupid. They were survival. So next time you wash your hands, wear bright shoes or sit wherever you like at dinner. Remember that once upon a time, each of those acts could have gotten you fined, cursed, or even excommunicated. History doesn't always move forward. Sometimes it just stops to smell itself and hopes the neighbors don't notice. Hey there, noble minds of curiosity. Welcome back. Before we dive into the next layer of medieval madness, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell. It helps this channel keep breathing through the fog of time. All right, ready? Let's travel back to a world where people were fined for smiling too wide, windows were taxed, and chewing too loudly could ruin your reputation. Because, my friends, in the Middle Ages, manners could kill you or save you. Let's start with something bizarre but true, the law of laughter. In the 14th century, in certain monastic orders, laughter was strictly forbidden. Monks took vows of silence, yes, but they also took vows against joy. Why? Because laughter was believed to be a gateway for the devil. A chuckle meant pride, a grin meant lust, a full laugh, that was almost heresy. Imagine living in a monastery where sneezing too loudly could earn you a week of penance. One chronicler even wrote that the devil dances upon the shoulders of the laughing monk. But here's the twist. The rule existed to protect the monks. Medieval monasteries were often filled with men who'd given up everything: family, freedom, food. They lived in silence, sleep-deprived, working from dawn till dusk. Laughter, they feared, could remind them of the world outside, of the joy they'd renounced. It wasn't just about piety. It was about psychological control. In short, if you never laugh, you never remember what you're missing. Now, let's talk about the window tax, a rule that sounds like satire but shaped European architecture. In 1696, England's King William III needed money for wars, but didn't want another public revolt over income taxes. So he taxed the rich in a creative way, by counting the number of windows in their homes. The logic? More windows, more wealth. But the poor suffered most, because landlords, desperate to avoid the tax, simply bricked up the windows of entire buildings. For over a century, cities across Europe literally became darker, physically and metaphorically. People lived in dim rooms, gasping for air, coughing from smoke, all because sunlight had become expensive. Doctors later noticed that people living in taxed houses got sicker, Children developed rickets from lack of sunlight. And yet, the tax stayed. Why? Because kings don't see the dark when they live in castles full of light. It wasn't abolished until the mid-1800s. By then, architecture itself had changed. That's why old European buildings often have strange, bricked-up windows. They're ghosts of a law that literally taxed daylight. And if you think that's insane, wait till you hear about the law of chewing. During grand feasts in noble courts, it was forbidden to chew with your mouth open, lick your fingers, or, God forbid, pick your teeth in public. Sounds like manners, right? But these weren't etiquette rules. They were survival codes. Medieval banquets were political arenas. Sitting beside the wrong person could get you poisoned. That's why knights were taught to keep one hand free while eating, to draw their sword if needed. And why they avoided licking their fingers. Because poison could be smeared on shared platters. Manners weren't just manners. They were self-defense. You didn't drink from another's goblet because you didn't know who wanted you dead. You didn't compliment your host too much. It might sound like flattery before betrayal. And you never, ever turned your back to the table. Even utensils had rank. Knives were for nobles. Peasants ate with hands or wooden spoons. Forks were considered unmanly at first until Italy made them fashionable, calling them angel fingers. Next, there was the beard law. Yes, beards were once taxed. In Tudor England, King Henry VIII, famous for having 6 wives and no chill, imposed a tax on facial hair, because apparently beards had become a symbol of wealth and masculinity. The longer your beard, the more you paid. Historians aren't sure whether Henry's goal was money or mockery. Maybe both. But it worked. Beards became political. When his daughter, Queen Elizabeth I, took the throne, she reintroduced the tax, making beards over 2 weeks old taxable property. Men literally shaved to survive. And yet, these laws made sense in a strange way. They controlled social appearance, enforced hierarchy, and reminded everyone who was boss, even over your face. Now let's talk about food. If you thought medieval diets were simple, bread, meat, ale, you're only half right. Every bite had rules. There were fasting laws, meat bans, and holy feasts, where people could be punished for eating the wrong dish on the wrong day. The church banned meat on Fridays, not for health, but for holiness. Butchers had to close. Fishmongers thrived. Entire towns changed their economy for religion. Breaking fast during Lent could cost you everything. In some places, a single bite of pork during Lent meant public flogging or excommunication. Yet even this madness had reason. During medieval winters, when meat spoiled quickly, fasting preserved food supplies. The church wrapped survival in scripture. God commands it, they said. But what they really meant was, winter's coming. And then there were noise laws. In the city of London, during the 1400s, certain districts banned night singing, shouting, or even loud laughter after curfew. Why? Because noise carried crime. Drunks drew thieves. Thieves drew guards. Guards drew blood. So silence wasn't politeness. It was safety. The pattern repeats again and again. Behind every absurd rule hides a practical truth. What we see as oppression was often an attempt, however clumsy, to survive a brutal world. But the strangest laws of all weren't about food or clothes or windows. They were about belief, what you could think, say, or even dream. And that's where we'll go next. Because in the medieval mind, thoughts could be crimes, words could be weapons, and curiosity could burn you at the stake. Hey, wanderers of the strange and the forgotten, welcome back to our journey through the Middle Ages, where even your thoughts could be crimes. Before we dive into the madness, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and ring the bell, so you never miss another story from the shadowed corners of our past. Now, take a deep breath. Because we're stepping into the part of history where laws no longer ruled behavior. They ruled the mind. Let's start with the law of thought. In medieval Europe, knowledge wasn't power. It was danger. The church controlled education, language, even curiosity itself. To question God was to question the world order, and that was treason, both spiritual and political. One of the strangest and deadliest laws of the era was the prohibition of forbidden books. The logic was simple. Only the clergy could interpret truth. Ordinary people reading the Bible in their own language? That was chaos. So, in 1231, Pope Gregory IX established the Inquisition, not only to root out heresy, but to destroy dangerous ideas. Imagine being burned alive, not for what you did, but for what you believed. Monks scoured villages for hidden texts, astronomy, philosophy, early science. Books were chained to walls, locked in monasteries. Knowledge itself became contraband. But here's the insane part. This censorship wasn't stupidity. It was strategy. Europe in the Middle Ages was fragile. Wars, famine, plague. The church believed one rumor, one false gospel, one curious scholar could unravel the faith that kept everyone obedient. So they did what every insecure power does. They built walls around truth. Yet even behind those walls, curiosity burned. Take Roger Bacon, a 13th century English friar. He dared to suggest that the rainbow was not divine magic, but light refraction. For that, he was imprisoned. Or Giordano Bruno, who believed the universe was infinite, that stars were suns with their own worlds. He was burned alive in Rome in 1600. His crime? Thinking too far ahead. So, the laws of thought weren't about logic. They were about control and fear. But belief wasn't the only thing policed. The Middle Ages had laws for how you could worship too. There was the law of bells. Yes, bells. In many villages, it was illegal to ring a church bell without permission. Because bells weren't just for prayer. They were the medieval alarm system. They warned of fire, invasion, or death. Unauthorized ringing could cause panic, or worse, rebellion. So only priests could control the sound that governed the town's rhythm. You didn't just live under the church. You heard it every hour. And then, there were the laws of silence. In monasteries, silence was sacred. But it wasn't only monks who lived by that rule. In some towns, there were laws forbidding women from speaking in council, tradesmen from shouting prices too loudly, or peasants from addressing nobles directly. Words had rank. Speech was privilege. The wrong phrase to the wrong person could end with your tongue cut out, literally. And yet, the logic was there again, twisted but real. In a world without microphones, newspapers, or rights, noise meant chaos. Order depended on who could speak, and who must remain silent. Now let's look at one of the strangest sets of laws ever written, the laws of heaven and earth. They came from the late Middle Ages, a mixture of religion and early science. The idea was that everything had a natural place ordained by God, men above women, nobles above peasants, heaven above earth. To challenge this divine order, even through invention, was sin. That's why early engineers, who tried to create flying machines or automata, mechanical men, were accused of witchcraft. They weren't inventors. They were playing God. The law didn't ban innovation outright, or it banned ambition. The belief was that if humans climbed too high, God would punish everyone. And in a world haunted by plague and famine, people needed someone to blame. Which brings us to the laws of witches. Few laws in history have been so destructive, yet so sincerely believed. Starting in the 15th century, Europe passed entire codes dedicated to identifying, torturing, and executing witches. You could be accused for anything: a bad harvest, a miscarriage, a sick cow. Women who owned herbs, lived alone, or simply knew how to read. All suspects. One of the most insane laws stated that if you confessed under torture, your confession was valid. If you didn't confess, that meant the devil was protecting you. So you were guilty anyway. A lose-lose situation wrapped in divine logic. But again, this madness had a reason. When the Black Death killed half of Europe, people needed an explanation. Why did children die? Why did prayers fail? The idea of invisible germs didn't exist, so people created invisible enemies. Witches became the scapegoats of a terrified world. And it worked. For a while, burning women gave people a sense of control, a delusion of safety. It's horrifying, but also deeply human. Because when logic fails, fear writes the laws. Still, not all thought crimes ended in flames. Some simply ended in exile. Scholars who questioned dogma fled to the Arab world, where Islamic philosophers preserved Greek and Roman texts. Without them, Europe might have forgotten Aristotle, medicine, mathematics, everything. In a strange way, the laws that tried to silence knowledge ended up spreading it. By driving free thinkers out, they seeded the Renaissance. So, in their attempt to freeze the world, the medieval lawmakers accidentally lit the match that would start the Age of Reason. But before that dawn came a darker night, one ruled by paranoia, torture, and divine bureaucracy. Welcome back, brave wanderers of the Dark Ages. Before we descend into the next circle of medieval madness, make sure to like, subscribe, and ring the bell, so you never miss another journey through the strangest truths of history. Because tonight, we're entering the world of medieval punishment, a place where pain was proof and justice was a ritual. Forget everything you know about law and order. In the Middle Ages, innocence wasn't decided by evidence. It was decided by God. Let's begin with the most infamous of all, trial by ordeal. When no one could agree on guilt or innocence, no witnesses, no proof, they simply let God choose. If you were accused of theft, blasphemy, or even witchcraft, you might face one of three trials: fire, water, or iron. The logic was brutal, but in their minds, fair. Take the ordeal of hot iron. A priest blessed an iron bar, heated it in the fire until it glowed red, and handed it to the accused. You had to walk 3 steps while holding it. Then your hand was wrapped in linen and sealed for 3 days. If, when unwrapped, your hand had healed cleanly, God had protected you. You were innocent. If it festered, well, the devil had shown his mark. It sounds barbaric. But here's the strange part. In many cases, people were found innocent. Why? Because priests quietly cooled the iron before handing it over, if they believed you. Justice in medieval Europe wasn't about facts. It was about faith. Then there was the ordeal by water. Innocence floated, guilt sank. Or depending on the decade, the opposite. In witch trials, accused women were bound and thrown into rivers. If they sank and drowned, they were innocent, but dead. If they floated, it meant the water, seen as pure, rejected them. They were guilty and burned. It's horrifying. But it wasn't random cruelty. In a world where plague, famine, and sin all felt like divine punishment, this logic gave people a strange comfort. God will decide. And for a society that believed heaven watched every breath, that made perfect sense. Next came trial by combat, when 2 men claimed the same land, or when words failed and swords spoke. God was expected to favor the righteous. From nobles in polished armor to peasants with sticks, fights to the death were legal evidence. Whoever survived was blessed by divine justice. There are real records of widows choosing champions to fight for them, sometimes small boys, old knights, or even priests. It was faith weaponized. And the crowd cheered as God, apparently, kept score. But the strangest punishments weren't the deadly ones. They were the theatrical ones. Take the shame masks. Metal cages placed over the face, shaped like donkeys, pigs, or demons. They were used on gossips, drunkards, or liars. Some even had bells, so everyone could hear you coming. It wasn't about torture. It was about humiliation. A walking warning: speak too much, drink too deep, laugh too loud, and you'll wear your sin on your face. Then there were the stocks and pillories, wooden frames in the town square, where criminals were locked by head and hands. Crowds gathered not just to watch, but to participate, throwing food, insults, or stones. Why? Because justice wasn't private. It was performance. Pain had to be seen to be believed. And yet even this had logic. Public punishment reminded everyone: order exists. Chaos is contained. When life feels fragile, cruelty feels like control. The church took this further with spiritual punishment. If you couldn't be tortured, you could be exorcised. A priest might tie you down, whip you with holy cords, or make you drink bitter herbs to drive out demons. Many of these possessed people were simply epileptic or mentally ill, but medieval minds didn't know that. To them, this was mercy. Pain freed the soul. Even the architecture reflected punishment. Gothic cathedrals weren't just holy places. They were reminders. Every gargoyle, every screaming face carved into stone, whispered one thing: this could be you. Sin was everywhere, crawling, flying, watching. Obedience was safety. And then, of course, came the Inquisition. A bureaucracy of fear. Interrogators asked questions not to find truth, but to confirm guilt. The rack, the wheel, the strapado, all instruments not of death, but of confession. A man might be stretched until his joints dislocated, then released, just enough to sign his confession. It was legal. It was divine. But even here, there was a grim logic. Torture wasn't about sadism, it was theology. They believed the body was corrupt, but the soul pure. So pain cleansed sin. A confession, even forced, saved your soul before death. And in their eyes, that was mercy. Medieval punishment wasn't designed to destroy. It was designed to redeem. Every whip, every burn, every scream had meaning. If your neighbor sinned, punishing him might save your town from God's wrath. If your heresy threatened others, killing you could purify them. It's twisted logic, but to them, it was sacred arithmetic. Suffering in this life equals salvation in the next. And yet, through all the cruelty, the Middle Ages were obsessed with forgiveness. You could buy indulgences, coins for heaven. You could walk barefoot for 100 miles and erase your sins. A murderer could still earn paradise if he died confessing on the gallows. In that contradiction, mercy through horror, lies the soul of the medieval world. They weren't monsters. They were terrified humans, doing the only thing they knew, trying to control fear with faith. But fear, once fed, grows. It's the story of rebellion, reason, and the first sparks of freedom. So, before we rise from the darkness into the dawn of a new age, like this video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, would you have survived medieval justice or confessed before the fire? Because next time, we enter the moment when the world finally said, enough. Welcome back, seekers of truth and shadows. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and ring the bell, because tonight, we're witnessing the moment when fear began to crack and the world took its first breath of freedom. We've walked through the filth, the faith, and the flames of the Middle Ages. Now, it's time to watch it all begin to crumble. For centuries, the Church had ruled through law and terror. Kings justified power as divine will. The poor obeyed, the rich confessed, and the world turned under God's unblinking eye. But somewhere in the 14th century, doubt began to whisper. It started small. A monk asking too many questions, a scholar daring to measure the stars. The same rules that once kept order now began to feel like chains. Let's begin with a moment that changed everything: the Black Death. When plague returned, killing 1 in 3 people, it shattered the medieval illusion that obedience guaranteed safety. Prayers didn't stop it. Holy relics didn't cure it. Priests died beside beggars. People began to wonder, if God is just, why are the innocent dying first? If the Church speaks for heaven, why can't it explain hell on earth? Fear lost its power, because everyone was suffering equally. And when fear fades, curiosity is born. Out of that despair rose thinkers like William of Ockham, who dared to say, the simplest explanation is usually the right one. It sounds obvious today, but back then it was revolutionary. Ockham argued that truth shouldn't depend on authority. It should depend on evidence. He was excommunicated, of course, but his words survived. They planted a seed. The idea that logic, not dogma, could rule the world. Then came the Renaissance. Artists, inventors, scientists, all rebelling in their own way. They studied human anatomy, built flying machines, painted the divine in human form. And with every brushstroke, every diagram, every experiment, they broke another law of the medieval mind. To understand how radical that was, imagine this. For 1,000 years, people believed to study the body was sin, because the body belonged to God. Then Leonardo da Vinci opened a corpse and drew the human heart, not as sin, but as art. That was treason to the old world and birth to the new. But the greatest rebellion wasn't scientific. It was spiritual. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door. He wasn't trying to start a revolution, just a conversation. But the moment those words hit wood, the Middle Ages began to end. Luther's crime was simple. He believed people didn't need priests to reach God. That truth, once unleashed, spread like wildfire. Printing presses multiplied his words faster than the church could burn them. For the first time in history, ordinary people began reading for themselves and realizing how much had been hidden. The laws of thought were breaking. Knowledge was no longer a sin, curiosity was no longer rebellion, and silence was no longer safety. But make no mistake, the transition wasn't peaceful. Reformers were hunted, burned, or beheaded. Cities drowned in blood between Protestants and Catholics. And yet, even through the smoke, the world was changing. The same Europe that once outlawed laughter now birthed humanism. The idea that life itself had value, not just the afterlife. The same kings who claimed divine rule now faced parliaments, councils, and uprisings. Even the witch hunts began to fade, not out of mercy, but out of exhaustion. People simply stopped believing fear. They'd seen too much death, too many false miracles, and they began to suspect the truth. The laws of heaven were written by men. Then came Galileo, a quiet Italian who dared to say, "The earth moves." He didn't shout, he didn't fight. He simply looked through a telescope and saw reality. For that, the church called him a heretic. But by then, it was too late. Once truth is seen, it can't be unseen. The medieval world was ending. The Renaissance had turned to reason, and reason would soon ignite the Enlightenment. The last relics of the old order, the laws of silence, of stench, of sin and superstition, all began to fade. But they left a shadow, one we still live under. Because even today, in every law, every taboo, every whisper of "that's forbidden," echoes the same medieval fear, that freedom is dangerous and knowledge is chaos. But maybe that's the point. Maybe civilization only grows when we dare to question what once seemed sacred, when we look at our own rules and wonder hundreds of years from now, which of our laws will seem just as absurd? The story of the Middle Ages isn't about darkness. It's about survival, adaptation, and the slow, painful evolution of human thought. They weren't fools. They were the beginning of us. So the next time you look at a cathedral, or a dusty law book, or a bricked-up medieval window, remember, every strange rule had a reason, and every reason eventually led here, to a world that still tries to understand itself. Because history doesn't die, it whispers, and if you listen closely enough, you can still hear the echo of those ancient bells. Thank you for watching, my friends. If you enjoyed this journey through time, like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who still believes the past was simple. Because as we've just seen, it never was.